In 1988, the programming language STOS was released for the Atari ST. Created by François Lyonnais and Constantin Sotiropoulos and published by company Mandarin Software, STOS was a derivative of the basic programming language. It was specifically designed to create games with a set of high-level graphics and sound commands. When it hit the shelves, the product came with 3 example titles. The first one, called Orbit, was a little Arkanoid clone. You had Zoltar, a Galaxian-style shooter, and finally the action game Bullet Train. All 3 games were programmed by François Lyonnais. After its initial release, commercially developed and shareware extensions were made available, which greatly expanded the longevity of the product, making it a pretty powerful package. The most well-known being STOS Maestro for adding sampled sounds and the Missing Link extension for faster horizontal scrolling. STOS had a big impact on the Atari scene. People who were intimidated by the complexity of 68K assembler could now take a shot at making their own games or demos. A lot of professional game developers today started their careers thanks to the efforts of François and Constantin. But there was also a downside as well. STOS was criticized for being slow, and because it opened the window for so many enthusiasts, Atari ST public domain libraries were stuffed to the gills with a lot of bad software. Games created using STOS were not taken seriously, especially by big-time publishers. And that's a real shame, because with a little TLC, it was possible to create a high-quality product. And even if they were just freeware titles, some of them have become true ST classics. Look at the beautiful graphic adventure Grandad, for example, or the action game Skate Tribe. Or what about the Animal Soft games like Psycho Pig or Color Clash? All highly recommended. A prime example is the story of developer Nick Harper, who had a verbal agreement with a big publishing company for his beautiful platformer Ozone. But once word got out the game was made with STOS, the deal was off. Eventually, Ozone was released 3 years later on ST format cover disc number 42. There are very few examples of commercial STOS games. Sky Strike by the Fothergill brothers comes to mind, or the Alien Breed clone Alien Thing, which we discussed in the past. But I think the biggest ever release must have been the game Prehistoric, the famous flip-screen platformer by French developer Titus Software, which was converted to every system imaginable and spawned a few sequels. We could spend several hours talking about all the functionalities of the almighty STOS package, but that's for another time. Today I want to bring you the story of one of the biggest names in STOS, the founder of the Stosser Diskmagazine, and the person who almost single-handedly changed the negative narrative by showing the world you could make a big, commercial quality game using the language. And he almost got it published. Almost. This is the history of Tony Greenwood. Tony was late at the computer party. He bought his very first home computer, the Atari 800 XL, at the end of 1990. 4 months later, in April of 91, the ZX Spectrum was acquired. Tony was not well educated. He left school in 1970 at the age of 14 with no qualifications and started a career as a professional truck driver. He never really got in touch with computers. These machines were bought second-hand mainly to play games with his sons. A few weeks after buying the Spectrum, however, an unfortunate event occurred. One day, having driven from the Lakes District to Fleetwood, Tony couldn't get out of the cab of his truck. His knee had swollen like a balloon. It turned out he had rheumatoid arthritis. He was unable to continue his job and had to take time off. As a kid, he always liked math, so he decided to go to the library and get a Basic for Beginners book. After a few weeks, he had made a game based on the television series Countdown, called Countout, which he also converted to the Atari 800 XL. But the 8-bit machines weren't cutting it. And since he was a Basic fan, he had his eyes on a new piece of software only available for the Atari ST. It was a special version of BASIC, specifically designed for making games. It came with routines you could call for sprites and animations. Tony was fascinated by this concept. So by 1992, the Atari ST entered the playfield. And that same year, Countout became Tony's first ever STOS game on the system. His next game was a Grid Cross, a simple two-player strategy game in which you had to defeat your opponent by making your way from one end of the grid to the other. He also did numerous small programs like Cheater, the biggest ST game cheat library, and the Talking Message Creator, which could be used to send an audible talking message to a contact. You were able to enter 500 lines of text and a photo, and the talker did the rest. A nice change from reading your typical doc file. Too bad ST didn't get it and gave it a bad review and decided it was only, and I quote, for making crap demos. But with just his ST and only the STOS manual, Tony was feeling lonely. He wanted to join the STOS user club, but they were no more. So he played with the idea to start one himself, but this was quickly canned. He decided to place a free advert in ST User Magazine for STOS contacts, and to his surprise, he received quite a bit of feedback. After a few back and forths, Tony got the idea of creating a Diskmagazine. As always, he dived into the project with both feet. After some debate, he came up with the name Stosser, just for a laugh. But little did he know he was about to create the most important STOS community ever to grace the ST scene. Stosser would be a pure STOS disk scene, completely coded in STOS and only dealing with all things STOS. It had the latest STOS news, STOS tutorials, tips and tricks, reviews of the latest STOS games and programs, interviews with famous STOSers and so much more. Issue 1 was released in April of 1993 and was completely programmed by Tony himself. A guy named Steve Gooding, a contact from the ST user ad, would become the editor for the next 5 issues. The disk scene was available through various PD libraries and got recognition pretty quickly. People started sending in articles, questions, code bits and intros. They came and went and some stayed. Almost right from the get-go, Keefe joined the team and became the magazine's most frequent writer. He took over the role as editor after Steve had left. As more issues got released, the team grew bigger. Bob Goodfellows, a talented graphics artist, created intro artwork and spiced up the actual shell, giving everything a more professional look. Martin Cubitt was given the position of STOS Doctor, helping out readers with their difficult questions. Deano Sharples, an avid writer, programmer and reviewer, provided another steady stream of content. And finally Tony himself, who focused on the technical side of things, showing off his coding skills by enhancing the magazine shell month after month. But even though Stosser was a beautiful project, Tony did not want to stop making games. He got ambitious again and wanted to be taken seriously. A company name was the start. He went with Stosser Software, as the brand name was already well established. But there was another problem. Tony could not design. He always had great ideas, but he couldn't draw a straight line. Yet he wanted to give his games a more professional look. So he went on the lookout for a skilled artist to do the graphics for his future work. Thanks to the contacts he had built with Stosser, finding people had become a breeze. And this was immediately apparent with his next release, Spot the Difference. A simple game, but something that had never been done on a computer at that time. Tony wanted to release a full disc with extra pictures for the game, all beautifully designed by Colin Pratt. But this never happened. Spot, as the game was also called, came third in the educational software roundup of the magazine ST Review. Next up, Tony was approached by the brother of Steve Gooding, former editor of Stosser magazine. Tony Gooding, a very talented graphics artist who went by the developer's name ToneSoft, had a great idea for an educational game, but was looking for a programmer. This collaboration led to the release of the never-ending coloring book. It turned out to be a beautiful children's game, and to their own surprise, got released on the cover disc of ST Format issue 56. Future Publishing never asked for permission though. In the end, after contacting ST Format, they did receive a payment for it. Eventually, Deano converted the piece of software to the Amiga as well. Smooth scrolling on a vanilla ST has always been a difficulty. As Tony was improving his coding skills, he wanted to give it a shot. The result was Multi-Pac-Man, a hyper-fast and furiously difficult two-player split-screen variant of the classic. The game got rave reviews in all Atari magazines and was a long-time freebie in the Floppy Shop PD library. To this day, it's one of the titles Tony is most pleased with. By April of 1994, at the end of an interview conducted in issue 12 of his own Stosser Diskmagazine, Tony revealed that together with his buddy Bob Goodfellows, work had begun on something very big. But he did not want to reveal any more details. Meanwhile, Stosser magazine was losing steam. This became apparent by issue 16, when Tony and editor Keefe made a desperate plea to their audience to send in more letters. By issue 18, the team had only received feedback from 2 readers, so Tony and Keefe called it quits. This would be the final issue of the magazine. A few weeks later, letters from disappointed fans started coming in the mailbox. Bob Goodfellows took over as editor and Stosser got resuscitated. Tony continued updating the shell. His work on the interface was lauded. It was so good, other disc magazines started using it. Eventually, Tony released it as the multimedia displayer, which received a score of 80% in the December 95 issue of ST Format. A first version was released on the cover disc of issue 68, and the full multimedia version was added to the magazine subscriber disc at the end of 1995. The Stosser Diskmagazine story ended with issue 29, lasting for almost 4 years. The final issue was released in March of 1997. Stosser was featured in all big, glossy ST magazines to mostly favorable reviews, and it was the programming catalyst for many. Names like Martin Milner and Robin Ball, who created Alien Thing, or Marcus Platt, author of the game Storm 94, or even James L. Matthews, head of Tobite Software, were all at one point involved with Stosser. Even Stosser's own Deano Sharples, who turned editor during the twilight years of the mag's existence, did some amazing things. As an amateur novelist, Deano was very interested in adventure games. Before joining the Stosser team, he had already created the STOS Adventure Creator, a program for easy text adventure creation, and numerous games, Mario's Quest being the best known. A little later, he joined forces with Tony Gooding. The duo started the company Silly Software, with the highlights of its catalog being the beautiful graphic adventures Mobster City and Granny's Garden. Deano also released the STOS Graphic Adventure Creator, the spiritual successor to SAC. Silly Software also tried the commercial route when Tobite Software published their art package Graphics Art in 1994. But wait, we were telling the Tony Greenwood story here, right? And didn't I say he was working on a big project with his buddy Bob? Tony always thought his Stosser friend Bob Goodfellows was a better programmer than he ever was. Yet Bob had absolutely no intention to take on this job when he talked to him about his new idea. Bob had written this really crazy story for a game project. At the Thor plant, which is a state-of-the-art maze-like bionuclear research facility, an employee spills his coffee over a control panel, causing the main control unit to go completely mad. This results in a bizarre situation in which the activation of the destruction sequence starts. All personnel gets locked up and there's radioactive waste everywhere. And the only person who can save the day is Jim McKenzie, the janitor of the building. Bob wanted to remake an old platform game he played on the Atari 2600, but for his new version he also was inspired by the games Prince of Persia and Flashback. He had already created some of the graphics and it was Tony's job to bring it all to life. And since Tony loved platform games, he agreed and immediately got started, taking Bob's input and feedback into account. And so, H.E.R.O on the ST was born. To turn the game into a silky smooth experience, Tony had some tricks up his sleeve. First off, as with his other games, H.E.R.O was not full screen motion. A lot of the screen was made up of the static console graphics. For the animation of the baddies, the bob command was used in STOS instead of the old sprite command. The bob command used the form of pre-shifting. The movements were pre-calculated using advanced planning before the actual game began. This used more memory, but was a big difference in performance. But the most important piece of magic was the illusion of movement. When you look closely, you will notice the main character doesn't actually change position when moving. When you put your finger on him, you will see he always stays at the same spot. It is actually the background that moves. A trick used by many commercial games as well. And because of this, you didn't have to use pre-shifted versions of every frame of Jim's animation. Instead, again with the missing link extension, you had commands at your disposal that allowed you to design large areas to be used as scrolling backgrounds. These were all made up of 16 by 16 pixel blocks that started as sprites. Applying pre-shifting on them, giving the game's scenery smooth and multi-directional scrolling. All of these tricks helped to cram as much info into one VBL or screen frame, an accomplishment Tony was most proud of. A few weeks later, a work-in-progress version of the game got in the hands of Victor Wright, the creator of the short-lasting magazine The ST Handbook. He was about to start a new publishing company called IDS, Independently Developed Software, and was looking for programs to be commercially released. He was very impressed with the work of Tony and Bob and wanted to release their game as a launch title for his company. The duo loved it, even if only for the kudos of being able to say they finally were able to release a commercial game. Vic Wright was a very ambitious ST fan, and for the months ahead, you couldn't even open one of the big ST magazines without seeing a mention of the upcoming H.E.R.O game. He even had a special full-page advert made for the release in ST Review, and he scored a deal with ST Format to release a one-level demo and a full preview coverage in issue number 63. The demo was rushed and featured preliminary sound samples, but all the in-game animations were there, and the demo played like a dream. Tony wanted to keep the fact this was a STOS game a bit quiet, so the demo arrived as one program, all external files preloaded, but he also doctored the actual program, so if anyone started looking with a sector editor, no giveaway STOS commands would be found. People just didn't have a clue, not even ST Format. By November 1994, Human Extraction and Rescue Operation was released by IDS, and for 15 quid you got a silky smooth Flashback clone on 2 floppy disks, featuring 60 action-packed levels, over 250 frames of animation, sampled sound and digital music by Greg Lovesey, who worked for Impact Software on the fantastic Snackman and the commercial footy game Team. An option to save the game was also implemented, and Bob had created a very impressive intro sequence using the program CyberPaint 2. These animations were integrated into the game using yet another STOS extension. But not long after the release, a sudden streak of bad luck happened. IDS went bankrupt and the rights to H.E.R.O were sold to a company called AWF. Eventually, after 3 months of sales, Tony and Bob received a check of £40, which they considered a total fraud. This was such an incredible disappointment for Bob, who at the time was still editor for Stosser magazine, that he instantly left the Atari ST and STOS scene, and to this day, Tony has never been able to reach him ever again. And a strange fact, at the moment of its demise, IDS also had the rights to the game Alien Thing and the Paint program graphics art. But both Martin Milner and Deano Sharples were able to reacquire the rights and went to James L. Matthews' publishing company Topbyte for the release of their software. After almost a year of trying to reach his partner, on the 23rd of July 1995, Tony decided to release H.E.R.O as freeware. He wanted the game to reach the broader public. This version had to be toned down a bit, because it needed to fit on one single floppy disk. The sampled sound was replaced by YM chiptunes composed by Nick Alderton, better known as Count Zero, and the intro sequence was omitted. The first few levels were remade with a better balance in difficulty, as this was a point of criticism in the original release. Tony wasn't gutted about the whole H.E.R.O debacle. He still had a lot of games in him. By the end of 1995, he released VidiGrid, a game very similar to VidGrid on the Atari Jaguar, but with its restrictions of course. A sequel soon followed, at the beginning of 1996, this time featuring more digitized animations of better quality. The VidiGrid games were great and well made, but eventually too easy. By May of 1996, it was time for another minute of fame, when the latest Stosser release called Island Strike was presented on ST format cover disc number 85. Dean Chadwick did the graphics and became the new partner in crime. Island Strike was a little Desert Strike clone. Not a bad game, but the controls needed some getting used to and the crosshair was sorely missing in the shoot 'em up. Stosser software was on fire. On the 28th of September of that same year, Tony's latest efforts were unveiled at the Birmingham Atari show, even though he never physically attended. Dean Chadwick was again responsible for the artwork. Because the duo were sick of seeing platform games that did not do the Atari ST justice, Heartland was created. Tony utilized the techniques he had used in H.E.R.O to create lightning-fast, multi-directional scrolling. And because the game featured less objects on screen, they had extra time in the VBL, which meant the bigger screen area. During development of the game, Tony used the Dizzy character from the Codemaster games as placeholder, while waiting for the graphics that Dean was creating. Eventually, new graphics were made, but none could match the feel they already had with Dizzy, so they kept him. Tony was able to contact the Oliver twins, and as long as it stayed non-commercial, he got permission. Players loved seeing this character return to the game screen. But in the end, Heartland felt bland. People were expecting more puzzle elements and action, which the game was lacking. So a few months later, a direct follow-up called Diamond Eyes saw the light of day to fix these issues. Both these games were the first Stosser games released as Commentware. Feedback was the only thing the creators asked for continuing supporting the Atari system. A fun bit of trivia: at the ST News International Christmas Coding Convention of 2000, Mr. Nee of the TOS crew released Heartland 2000, a remake of the original, now running in one VBL on all Atari compatible systems. By 1997, work had begun on a new platform game specifically aimed for children. Billy Boy was released in April to coincide with the UK Atari show, organized by Goodman's International PDL, and the game looked damn near perfect. But in the back of his mind, Tony never got over the fact that H.E.R.O was not compatible with TOS 2.06, and this led to the creation of H.E.R.O 2. This sequel was actually the same game, but this time only for the Atari ST and Falcon machines, featuring more animations and enhanced crystal clear sound effects. The development was a bit of a struggle, but eventually this ultimate edition of the game came on 3 discs and was released in September of 1997.
That was fun.
Tony and Dean started working on a new puzzle game called Thinker, but by October 1997 nobody was playing Atari ST games anymore, and incentives to make games was at an all-time low. The game was given to Deano Sharples, but in the end got lost in time. And without knowing, H.E.R.O 2 became Stosser Software's swan song. A pretty good way to end indeed. Between all the game making, Tony's relationship with ST format and its crew blossomed, and he was commissioned by Future Publishing to write a few STOS articles for the magazine. Tony started as a professional truck driver, got in touch with computers and learned basics somewhere on the way. He began making a living by building websites, creating scripts, and at one point even programming games in JavaScript. The very first site he built was for Deano's Silly software, and that even ran on the Atari browser CAP. But after over 20 years in computers, he got fed up. Around 2008 he had to reinvent himself and he became a professional sports photographer. Talking about having an interesting and diverse career. So was H.E.R.O worthy of being a commercial release? Tony thinks not. I think it was. It might not be a match to Flashback, but H.E.R.O was a great game with amazing animation and was much better compared to some commercial games. But as always, it was released too late in the ST's lifespan. At the end of 1994, the FPS craze was in full swing. Doom was already out for almost 1.5 years and very few people still played Atari. Except for me, of course. And that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, stay Atari. Bye.